All right, part two. What questions can we ask now that you've got your data? What questions can we ask you about that data? All right, here are some examples. Describe the data set. Compare two categories from your data set. Perform a regression analysis and write a report on your findings. Represent the data graphically. Make a forecast. All right, these are types of questions that we can ask you, that SAC style questions that we can ask you based on your data set. Now, when you're describing the data set, things that you might want to consider are shape, center, and spread. Oop, can't spell. So those are the kinds of things that we're going to expect you to be able to say when you describe the data set. We're not going to ask you, describe the shape of the data set, describe the center, describe the spread. You need to know which one, what to talk about when we say describe. Describe implies that you're going to be doing these three things, okay? Now, within these three things, your measure of center, which one are you going to use? And I would say that if you look at the shape, you know which measure of center you will use. Remember that our measures of center are median and mean. We rarely use mode. But if we're using mean, there are certain conditions that our data set has to have on its shape. So shape decides what measure of center you're going to use. Measure of spread, this is up to you. You can use IQR or you can use standard deviation. But know that this is the question you're going to get. Describe the data set. You have to answer knowing to describe the shape, the center, and the spread. And you need to talk a little bit about them. You need to say, you can't just leave it, okay, the center is this, the mean is this. You need to say the mean is, let's say, 28.5. That means 28.5 on average are expected to blah, blah, blah. Something like that. You need to write a sentence about it. So that's the kind of thing that we're expecting from this SAC. If something asks you to compare two categories from your data set, you're going to be comparing shape, center, and spread. And spread. Again, you're going to use the shape to determine what measure of center you're going to use and justify it and literally write everything you can. You're writing, in some sense, you're writing a report style. So please keep that in mind when a question asks you to compare. You're not just saying one is better than the other, one is higher than the other. You have to mention shape, center, and spread and have those sentences. So you might say that, for example, the before and after of that data that we had before. Before the yogurt was moved to a different place on the shelf, the average was 25.5 sales per week. Whereas afterwards, the average was, or the mean was 29.6 sales per week. Therefore, the average sales has increased, and this would probably be seen to be a successful strategy for this person to have taken. So that product placement was a better product placement than it was before. So here we mentioned the center, we mentioned the mean. Now I'm not saying that the mean was the right one in this case, but we did. We mentioned the mean and we compared them between the before and the after case. We also said that this means that that strategy was probably a successful strategy because the mean was higher in the after case. We also might mention spread. Maybe the standard deviation are basically the same. So we can say that the strategy didn't really have much influence on the variability of sales. What it did have an influence on was where the actual sales were centered. So the sales were now centered around this new mean. So the average sales have increased. So that's a good thing. That means it was a good, probably a successful strategy. All of these words that I'm saying are things that you want to be writing down in your SAC response to a question that says compare. All right, perform a regression analysis. This is something that I hope it's beating a dead horse at this point. You need to know all 8 steps of that regression analysis. The 8th step is writing a report. So you need to know how to write that report, on the regression analysis that you do. So there's no excuse at this point. There's plenty of time now to know and have somewhere in your notes, because you're allowed to use your bound reference in this case, to have somewhere in your notes what a regression analysis is. And when we ask you the question of doing a regression analysis, you have to do all of the steps. Don't omit a single step. Have every single one of them, because it is a big question and it should take you about an hour if you do it properly. All right, this next question: represent the data graphically. All right, what types of graphical representation can I use? If I've got categorical data, what graphs can I use for categorical data? What graphs can I use for 2 continuous data sets? Look back on your notes. There's specifically a lesson about which graph to use. Which graph? Look at your notes for that. Really important. So you know which graph you can use given what types of data you're using. And a really good thing is, since you're selecting the data yourself, you might already have in mind which graph you can use for the data sets that you have found. So this is where you can have the answers to the SAC before you even go into the SAC. It's basically, we're allowing you to cheat in this case, as long as you do it properly. It's not actually cheating, just as a caveat. It's not cheating, it's just being prepared. Finally, making a forecast. That might be a question that we ask you. How do you make a forecast? I would suggest that the only way that we've shown you how to make a forecast is by doing a regression line and substituting a value in. Now, a forecast is always going to be extrapolative. So what might you say about the forecast because it's extrapolative? That kind of thing. So in your SAC, we give you a really vague question. So the questions here are all quite vague. You're expected to know that describe the dataset means shape, center, spread. Compare 2 categories means comparing shape, center, and spread. Performing a regression analysis means those 7 steps. Well, 8 steps if you count the report. Representing data graphically, you have to know which graph to use. We're not going to tell you to do a histogram, or to do a scatter plot, or to do a back-to-back stem and leaf plot, or any of those. You're going to be expected to know which one to use. When making a forecast, you need to know that you're going to be using probably a regression line to make that forecast. So, these are all the things that you should know how to do. One thing as well, or 2 things that weren't mentioned on the previous slide. Do you know how to do a transformation? If you're doing COVID-19 data, we saw that it was exponential. You can see that the number of cases per day is exponential. Another word, the inverse of exponential is logarithmic. So you're probably going to be doing a log transformation to make it linear. So if you're using COVID-19 data, you might want to know how to do the transformations to make it linear, because remember, we can only use the data if it is linear. So just have a think about that. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it, and it shows that you know more about it if you know that if a data is non-linear, that you have to do a transformation and which transformation to use. Finally, so that's just mentioning that part. Finally, doing a time series analysis. This is stuff like mentioning the characteristics. And doing stuff like smoothing. Can you do all that? So characteristics were like seasonality, cyclicity, irregular fluctuations, trends, that kind of thing. So these are the things that you need to know how to do. And the thing is, in this SAC, we're not going to outline exactly what you need to do. You have to figure it out yourself. It's almost self-guided. You need to know the things that you need to do for the SAC. There are certain things though that you can do to make this easier on yourself. You can think about the types of questions we can ask, and you can choose data which makes those questions easier to answer. So that's up to you. You choose the data, and you should already know how to use the data, how to work the data, how to analyze it before you even walk into that second session of the SAC, right? So you need to have a way of analyzing the data before you even walk into that SAC. And that will make it so much easier on yourself than if you've chosen data that's really messy, maybe it uses only zeros and ones or dummy variables, in which case you can't even use that. So make sure you know how to use your data set before you actually walk into the SAC. That's the end of this session. If you have any questions, please send me an email, chuck me a message on Microsoft Teams, however you want to contact me. I will make these slides available and last year's SAC available on Google Drive, and I'll email it all to you guys. So thanks very much.